Long ago, near a wide river that shimmered under the African sun, lay a cluster of villages woven together by kinship and trade. These villages were known collectively as the Ibaye Valley, a fertile stretch of land where baobab trees spread their thick branches, and fields of millet and yam swayed in the breeze like waves in a green ocean. In this valley, people lived close to the earth and to one another, following customs passed down from their ancestors. They sang praises to their spirits at dawn, offered libations at dusk, and shared stories around crackling fires beneath velvet skies filled with countless stars. On the western edge of these villages stood the homestead of Babatunde and Ifeoma. Babatunde was a respected elder, known for his fairness and gentle words that soothed quarrels. Ifeoma, his wife, was once admired for her grace and beauty. They had a daughter, Abeni, whose kindness shone bright as the morning sun. She was beloved by all who knew her, for she carried a warm smile and a calm spirit. In the heart of the valley, near the great baobab which served as a meeting place, people often remarked how Abeni's laugh reminded them of birdsong after the rainy season. Across the valley, in a homestead lined with tall wooden fences and intricately carved gates, lived Chief Kato and his family. Chief Kato held authority over a cluster of villages. He was known not just for his leadership, but also for his travels, having journeyed far across grasslands and deserts in search of trade and alliances. His home was filled with mats dyed in rich colors and gourds carved into delicate shapes. And Chief Kato had a son, Olumide, a young man who moved with the quiet grace of a leopard and spoke with a wisdom beyond his years. Olumide's compassion and patience made him stand out among other young men. Everyone believed he would someday become a leader as great as his father. It was with joy that both families announced that Abeni would wed Olumide. This union promised to strengthen bonds between lineages and ensure peace and prosperity in the valley. When word spread that Abeni and Olumide would soon marry, the villagers drummed and danced. Women wove special cloths from fine cotton, singing wedding songs as they worked. The men brewed sweet palm wine, and children gathered wildflowers, excited by the promise of a grand feast. As preparations unfolded, Chief Kato had traveled abroad for many months on trade missions. He planned to return just in time for the wedding. Meanwhile, Olumide's mother and Babatunde's family arranged the ceremony with meticulous care. They chose a day when the rains would have softened the earth, leaving the valley lush and full of life. The marriage would be held at a sacred clearing beside the mighty baobab, where ancestors were honored. The night before the wedding, countless lanterns flickered around Babatunde's homestead. Guests had begun to arrive, bringing gifts of woven baskets, calabashes of honey, dried fish and yams. The air was rich with the scent of stew bubbling in clay pots. Abeni watched from a doorway as friends and relatives gathered. She could not help smiling. Olumide was kind and gentle, and she felt blessed. She slipped into sleep that night dreaming of a happy future. Children playing in the yard, evening walks along the riverbank, and laughter shared under moonlight. When dawn arrived, it was pure gold. The sun's first rays filtered through thatched roofs and wooden shutters. Hens clucked softly, and goats stirred in their pens. Abeni rose early, her heart dancing. She washed in scented water, her skin glowing. She wrapped herself in a robe of white cotton embroidered with golden thread, special cloth woven by her aunties to mark this joyful occasion. She looked at herself in a small, polished mirror. Today, she would become a wife. Soon, women came singing into her room, smearing her arms with fragrant oils, placing necklaces of polished beads around her neck, and arranging her headscarf so that it sat perfectly, crowned with fresh flowers. Abeni's face shone. She felt like a princess stepping into a story told by the elders. As the sun climbed higher, Abeni's heart thrilled at the thought of seeing Olumide. According to custom, she would greet him privately before the public ceremonies began. Olumide waited in a special guest lodge at the edge of the chief's compound, a place prepared for grooms on their wedding day. There he would don his own ceremonial robes and wait quietly for the bride's arrival, reflecting on their new life ahead. Abeni left her family's hut with a light step. She passed through courtyards and along a narrow path lined with hibiscus flowers. Her spirit was full of hope and love. The air smelled of morning dew and warming earth. Drums had not yet started, the moment was hushed. She approached Olumide's lodge, her footsteps soft on the red clay floor. A few kinswomen trailing behind stopped at the threshold, giving her privacy. Upon entering the lodge's doorway, Abeni expected to see Olumide dressed in fine garments, perhaps smiling at her with tender eyes. Instead, she stumbled into a scene that froze her blood. There, on the sleeping mat in the center of the room, she saw her mother, Ifeoma, entangled with Olumide in a way that no words could properly describe. Ifeoma was perched atop him, both of them half-dressed, their faces twisted in shock and shame as they noticed Abeni. For a moment, Abeni could not breathe. Her heart hammered painfully, and the world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Everything was wrong. The man she loved, and her own mother. How could this be? She tried to form words, but her mouth went dry and only a whisper escaped. "Mama." The word was thin, trembling, hardly her own voice. Ifeoma's face went ashen. She scrambled off Olumide, pulling at her garments, stammering nonsense. Olumide looked equally shocked, eyes wide with despair, lips parted but voiceless. Abeni's vision blurred with tears. She turned and fled, unable to remain in that cursed room another heartbeat. She ran blindly through corridors, her white gown trailing behind her like a wounded swan's wings. Servants and guests, busy with wedding preparations, looked up in confusion. Why was the bride running, tears in her eyes, anguish marking her face like a scar? Abeni burst from the compound and onto a dirt path. She ran toward the outskirts, wishing she could leave behind not just the wedding but her entire life. All her dreams lay shattered. With each step, her tears fell onto the ground. She did not know where she was going. She just wanted to escape. Back at the lodge, Olumide scrambled to dress himself. He called after her, stumbling outside in little more than a loincloth. "Abeni," he shouted, voice cracking. "It is not as it seems." But as he charged into the bright morning light, he realized he was nearly naked. Villagers had begun to gather, and seeing him so exposed, he rushed back inside to clothe himself properly, cursing the wretched hour and the terrible misunderstanding that had taken hold. Abeni's flight took her across a courtyard and down a flight of stairs leading to a quieter part of the village. In her haste, she collided with her father, Babatunde, who had just arrived to escort her to the ceremony. The force nearly knocked them both over. Babatunde caught her by the shoulders, alarmed at the terror in her eyes. "My child, what has happened?" he asked urgently. Abeni could not speak. She could barely see her father through a veil of tears. She only managed to stammer, "Mama, Mama," and "Olumide." Then she pulled free, running once more. Babatunde stood stunned, confusion and dread coiling in his stomach. Had he heard correctly? His wife and his daughter's groom? He did not want to believe it, but Abeni's horror was unmistakable. Without delay, he turned and rushed toward Olumide's lodge, heart pounding. By now the lodge was in chaos. Ifeoma tried to straighten her clothes, her face burning with shame. Olumide, having pulled on a fine embroidered tunic and trousers, stood like a man condemned. When Babatunde flung open the door, what he saw confirmed his worst fears. garments strewn across the floor, the scent of sweat and panic in the air. His beloved Ifeoma. His future son-in-law Olumide. The silence was as thick as river mud. "Betrayers!" Babatunde shouted, voice trembling. He could not process the enormity of this betrayal, so he simply glared at them, chest heaving. "I trusted you, Olumide. And Ifeoma, how could you? Your own child's wedding day." Anger and heartbreak waged war inside him. Ifeoma hung her head, tears staining her cheeks. Olumide's words died in his throat, for what explanation could justify the scene Abeni had witnessed? Meanwhile, Abeni fled beyond the gates. She had no plan, no direction, only the need to outrun her pain. She rushed toward the river road, where the land sloped gently. The morning had grown warmer, and a flock of white egrets took flight at her approach. She heard someone shout her name but ignored it. Just then, a chariot approached from the eastern path, drawn by 2 sturdy donkeys. It was Chief Cato returning from his travels, eager to witness his son's joyful marriage. He had brought fine gifts and rare spices as wedding presents. As he neared the compound, he saw a figure in white racing toward him, a bride? Confused, he slowed the chariot. A guard beside him called, "Stop, child, be careful." Abeni did not see the chariot until too late. The guard shouted and the driver pulled the reins, but there was a sickening thud as Abeni stumbled in front of the wheels. The chariot halted abruptly. Chief Cato leapt down, heart in his mouth. Before him lay the bride he had never met but knew by name, crumpled on the ground, faint from shock and despair. The morning sun blazed overhead as he lifted Abeni's limp form into his arms. "Find help," Chief Cato commanded his guard. Nearby villagers, startled by the commotion, rushed forward. Cato carried Abeni to a healer's hut just outside the palisade. There, old Midawo Adan, a wise medicine woman, began to tend the injured bride. Cato's mind swirled with questions. Why had Abeni been running like a frightened antelope? Where was Olumide, and why was the wedding not underway? Back at the lodge, Olumide finally mustered the courage to run after Abeni, only to see his father's chariot disappearing down the road. He caught a glimpse of Abeni's limp body in his father's arms. Panic seized him. "Father, wait," he called, but the chariot rattled away. Without a second thought, Olumide sprinted to his own horse and galloped after them, fear gripping him tighter than a python's coils. By now the entire wedding congregation sensed something was terribly wrong. Guests murmured uneasily. Wasn't the bride supposed to be dancing with her attendants by now? Drums that should have signaled celebration were silent. Babatunde's kinsman whispered, "What misfortune is this?" Olumide's relatives exchanged worried glances. The joyous day had become a river of confusion. By now the lodge was in chaos. Ifeoma tried to straighten her clothes, her face burning with shame. Olumide, having pulled on a fine embroidered tunic and trousers, stood like a man condemned. When Babatunde flung open the door, what he saw confirmed his worst fears. Garments strewn across the floor, the scent of sweat and panic in the air. His beloved Ifeoma. His future son-in-law Olumide. The silence was as thick as river mud. Babatunde, enraged and broken-hearted, rushed outside to see the chaos for himself. He spotted a groom's attendant who had witnessed Abeni's flight and tried to piece together what had happened. Then someone shouted that Abeni had been injured near the main gate. Babatunde's blood turned cold. He grabbed a walking stick and set off at once for the healer's hut, desperate to find his daughter and understand this nightmare. Meanwhile, Abeni fled beyond the gates. She had no plan, no direction, only the need to outrun her pain. She rushed toward the river road, where the land sloped gently. The morning had grown warmer, and a flock of white egrets took flight at her approach. She heard someone shout her name but ignored it. At the healer's hut, Chief Kato and Olumide stood with worried faces. Abeni lay inside on a cot woven from reeds, her bridal gown stained and torn. Midawo Adan had cleaned her wounds and found that her leg was badly bruised and bleeding. The healer ground herbs into a poultice and prayed softly to the spirits to mend the child's shattered soul. Chief Kato turned to Olumide, voice firm. "My son, what is the meaning of this? Why was Abeni running as if chased by devils?" Olumide's heart sank. He knew he would have to explain, but how to do so without disgrace? "Father," he said quietly, gaze fixed on the hut's straw floor, "I know how this looks, but I beg you, believe me. I did not call Abeni's mother to my room, nor did I willingly betray my bride. I was ambushed, taken by surprise. I tried to resist, but I was at a loss, confused and afraid of offending my future mother-in-law." He broke off, tears welling in his eyes. Abeni came at the worst possible moment and saw only horror. At the healer's hut, Chief Kato and Olumide stood with worried faces. Abeni lay inside on a cot woven from reeds, her bridal gown stained and torn. Midawo Adan had cleaned her wounds and found that her leg was badly bruised and bleeding. The healer ground herbs into a poultice and prayed softly to the spirits to mend the child's shattered soul. Just then Baba Tunde arrived, panting from his journey. He burst into the hut and saw his daughter lying pale and wounded. "Abeni," he whispered, falling to his knees beside her. "My child, my precious child." Tears rolled down his cheeks. He looked up and saw Chief Kato and Olumide. Rage flickered in his eyes again. "So here you are," he spat at Olumide. "You dare stand here after what you did?" Olumide bowed his head, knowing words would only inflame the moment. Chief Kato placed a firm hand on Babatunde's shoulder. "We must calm ourselves," he said. "Abeni's health comes first. Let the healer do her work." It took effort, but Babatunde forced himself to breathe deeply and remain still. Meanwhile, word reached the other guests that the bride had been found, but injured, and was now in a healer's hut. Whispers traveled like harmattan dust. Has a curse fallen upon the wedding? Some recalled old prophecies about hidden truths bubbling to the surface like bitter roots. The entire valley trembled with uncertainty. Eventually, the healer emerged. "Abeni is awake," she said softly. "But she is very fragile. Only a few may enter." Chief Kato, Babatunde, and Olumide stepped into the dim hut. Abeni lay with her leg bandaged, face drawn and eyes red-rimmed. When she saw Olumide, she shrank back, tears glistening anew. "Abeni," Olumide began quietly, "I must beg for your understanding. I know what you saw was unspeakable. I know your heart is broken. But I swear, I never desired this. I never—" Abeni silenced him with a glare. "Do not speak of what I saw," she said bitterly. "I saw my mother's dishonor and your betrayal. My soul aches. How can we ever speak of marriage now?" Her voice faltered, and she began to sob. Babatunde tried to comfort her, stroking her hand. Chief Kato's face grew grim. Everything he had built and hoped for was crumbling. As they spoke, Ifeoma arrived outside the hut. She had gathered her courage to face the truth. She stood by the doorway, weeping quietly. Babatunde heard her muffled sobs and stormed outside. "Do you dare show your face here?" he hissed. Ifeoma raised a trembling hand. "I must speak," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "The truth has been hidden too long." Babatunde did not understand. "What truth could possibly excuse your deed?" he demanded. Ifeoma shook her head. "No excuses," she said. "Only confessions." Her eyes darted to Chief Kato, who had followed Babatunde outside. Olumide stood behind his father. Abeni tried to listen from inside the hut, fear twisting in her gut. Just then Babatunde arrived, panting from his journey. He burst into the hut and saw his daughter lying pale and wounded. "Abeni," he whispered, falling to his knees beside her. "My child, my precious child." Tears rolled down his cheeks. He looked up and saw Chief Kato and Olumide. Rage flickered in his eyes again. At these words, a hush fell so complete that even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. Chief Kato's eyes narrowed. He remembered those distant days well, when Ifeoma was his beloved and Babatunde his closest friend. He remembered inviting Babatunde into their home to help him find work, trusting him as a brother. He remembered returning unexpectedly one day to find Ifeoma and Babatunde entwined, breaking his heart. In fury and despair, he had cast them both out of his life. But now Ifeoma's voice trembled with new revelations. "When you left us in anger, I discovered I was carrying your child," Ifeoma said, tears streaming freely. "I was terrified. I was already living with Babatunde and I feared losing him. I never told him the truth. I let him believe the child was his. That child was Abeni." Chief Kato staggered back as if struck. Babatunde's jaw dropped. Inside the hut, Abeni heard every word. She gasped, pain engulfing her once more. Olumide's mind reeled. Abeni was his father's child? That meant... Abeni found her voice, weak but urgent. "No," she cried. "This cannot be." Olumide rushed inside, eyes wide with horror. Abeni reached for him, tears falling. "Olumide, if I am the daughter of Chief Kato, then you are my half-brother." The words hung in the hut's stale air, monstrous and cruel. Olumide shook his head, refusing to believe. But the pieces fit too well. He sank to his knees, sobbing. All the dreams he had nurtured, marriage, family, a peaceful future, dissolved like mist. The two people who had planned to bind their lives in love were tied by blood instead. Chief Kato exploded with rage and grief. "This cannot be," he roared outside, startling birds into flight. "I demand tests, proof. I will not believe these words without proof." He called for the village's wise diviner, who knew the old ways of testing blood with certain herbs and incantations. As night fell, torches were lit, casting flickering light on grim faces. The diviner, a stooped old woman with painted cheeks and a staff carved with mysterious symbols, tested drops of blood from Abeni, from Olumide, from Chief Kato, from Babatunde, and from Ifeoma. She murmured prayers to the ancestors and dropped herbs into bowls of warm goat's blood. Everyone waited in silence, hearts pounding. At length, the diviner raised her staff and pronounced the truth. Abeni was indeed the child of Chief Kato. Gasps and moans filled the night. Abeni fainted again from sorrow, her body too weak to endure such torment. But the night's revelations were not over. There was Abeni's younger brother to consider. His blood did not match Babatunde's either. Ifeoma, cornered by questions, confessed he was the child of another man, Musa, a gatekeeper who once worked for Babatunde. The layers of deception piled higher, choking the air. Babatunde felt his strength fail him. The man who had raised these children, believing them his own, learned now he was father to none. He collapsed in agony, unconscious. The valley's people who had gathered outside, hoping for a wedding feast, were now witnesses to a tragedy that would echo through generations. Songs of joy were replaced by hushed whispers and fearful glances. Some murmured that a curse had fallen upon these families. Others said it was the ancestors teaching a harsh lesson about betrayal and hidden sins. For days, the families tried to recover. Abeni's physical wounds healed under Midawo Adan's care, but her spirit remained raw. She could not look at Olumide without recalling their doomed love. Olumide drifted through his father's compound like a ghost, silent and vacant. Babatunde avoided everyone, trying to comprehend the decades of lies he had been living. Ifeoma, now shunned by both households, wept beneath the baobab tree, where only the shade and the wind would listen. Chief Kato withdrew from public life, struggling with old heartbreak reopened. He had lost Ifeoma's love long ago, but now he gained a daughter only to lose her too as a bride for his son. He paced his courtyard at night, pondering how such knots of fate could be untangled. No simple apologies would suffice. The pain was too deep, the wounds too fresh. Weeks passed, and the village elders convened. They decided a cleansing ritual was needed. They would gather at the sacred grove by the river, make offerings, and ask the ancestors to guide them. On the appointed night, torches flickered along the trails as both families filed toward the grove. Abeni, supported by her younger brother, walked behind Babatunde, who leaned on a staff. Ifeoma followed at a distance, face hidden behind a veil. Olumide and Chief Kato arrived from another path, each carrying a bundle of kola nuts and cowrie shells for the offering. The elders formed a circle beneath towering trees. The diviner chanted songs older than memory, calling on spirits of sky and earth, wind and water. She poured libations onto the ground and sprinkled white chalk around the circle. Then, one by one, members of the shattered families came forward to speak truth, each phrase cutting through the humid night air. Ifeoma confessed her betrayals, begging forgiveness from Abeni, Babatunde, and Chief Kato. Babatunde admitted his own faults, including his pride and failure to see signs of unrest in his home. Chief Kato spoke with a trembling voice of lost love, friendship betrayed, and the burden of secrets. Finally, Abeni and Olumide stood side by side for the last time. Abeni spoke softly. "We dreamed of a life together. We wanted to share laughter and children, to grow old under the sun of this valley. Now we find we share blood, and our dreams must die. I cannot hate you for what was not your fault, Olumide. But I cannot be your wife. Our bond is forever changed." She took a small gourd of water and poured it on the ground, a symbol of the life that would not be lived. Olumide wept silently, nodding his acceptance of this bitter truth. When all had spoken, the diviner scattered leaves onto a small fire, sending fragrant smoke into the starry sky. "Ancestors," she called. "These souls are lost in a thicket of betrayals and pain. Show them a path to forgiveness, if not today, then in time. Let their wounds heal, and let them learn the weight of their choices." In the distance, hyenas laughed and owls hooted, as if the night itself bore witness. In the following days, the families slowly began to mend, not together, but separately. Chief Kato granted Abeni a plot of fertile land near the river, where she could start a new life. Babatunde, shamed but still an elder, returned to his duties, wiser and sadder. Ifeoma, carrying the guilt of her deeds, chose to live quietly, weaving baskets and trading them for food, keeping to the edges of village life. Olumide went traveling, joining a caravan heading north, hoping that distance and time might ease his bleeding heart. Before he left, he gave Abeni a beautifully carved wooden figure of a bird, wings spread wide. "May you find freedom," he said. Abeni accepted it with tears, wishing him also the peace he sought. Years passed. The story of that cursed wedding day and the secrets uncovered beneath the baobab tree became a folktale told by grandmothers to wide-eyed children. They told how a day of joy unraveled into catastrophe when truth emerged from the shadows. They taught that betrayals, no matter how buried, will sprout like thorny weeds to pierce the heart. They warned that love without honesty is like a pot with a hidden crack. It may hold water for a time, but eventually it will shatter, spilling sorrow onto the ground, Abeni grew older. She never married, but she became a respected weaver, known for intricate patterns that told stories of pain, endurance, and survival. When customers asked about the meaning of her designs, she would smile sadly and say, "They remind us that truth is our anchor. Secrets break the bonds we cherish." People would nod gravely, remembering the old tales. In distant lands, Olumide also matured. He carried the memory of Abeni's face, both as a beloved bride he almost had, and as a sister bound to him by blood. With time, he forgave himself and accepted the past. He learned from sages in foreign villages, traded stories with wanderers, and eventually returned to the Ibaye Valley as a traveling merchant. He never asked Abeni to be his wife, of course. Instead, he greeted her as a long-lost sibling, bringing rare dyes and fine cotton. In silence, they acknowledged a bond that could never be changed and promised never to forget the lessons learned. Chief Kato grew old and stepped down as leader, passing his duties to younger, more hopeful men. He would sit beneath the baobab tree, where once a wedding feast had been planned, and listen to the wind. Babatunde continued as an elder, advising young couples to cherish honesty above all. Ifeoma lived quietly, helping orphan children learn crafts and trying to atone for her misdeeds through acts of kindness. She never reclaimed her former status, but she found a sort of peace in giving rather than taking. In the seasons that followed, the Ibaye Valley thrived. Yams grew abundant, rivers flowed steadily, and trade prospered. The shadows of that terrible day lingered only as a memory, a warning whispered to generations yet unborn. Sometimes, on nights when the moon was full and the fires crackled, someone would mention the tale: the bride who ran weeping through the dawn, the mother's shame, the father's heartbreak, the groom's despair, and the old chief's lost love. And always, the lesson remained. No matter how long it is hidden, truth will rise like the morning sun, and when it does, the heart must face it with courage. Such is the story carried by the warm wind in the valley, rustling leaves beneath the ancient baobab. It reminds all who listen that only in truth can we find true belonging, and only through honesty can we weave bonds that do not unravel at the first tug of fate's rough hand.